I'm joined today by Dr. Travis Campbell. He is one of our visiting scholars, and we've been talking about various apologetic topics. Travis, one of the challenges that I have, and I wonder whether you have it, and that is when I'm talking with people about the truth of Christianity, whether it's in person or whether it may be on social media or on the web, how do I communicate the truth of the gospel, but also convey to them the values that I have? And the values that I have is being gracious. I mean, I'm always conflicted with the idea that you believe in salvation by grace, but you don't treat people graciously. What are some of the ideas that you have that could help us in terms of presenting the gospel with clarity, but also with a sense of gentleness and respect, as Peter says?
Well, another Peter, named Peter Kreeft, said that one of the greatest arguments against Christianity is Christians.
Ooh.
And I think that one of the saddest things about the modern church is that you have many, many Christians who are not well versed in apologetics at all. In fact, I would say most Christians don't appreciate the whole practice of apologetics. But then, unfortunately, many who get involved in apologetical ministries or just engage in apologetical discussions with their unbelieving friends are very mean people. I have many friends now that struggle with the truth of Christianity who are Christians, but they keep running into Christians that treat them terribly, as you say, treat them without grace. So I think that the first thing that every Christian would-be apologist needs to get clearly in his or her head is the injunction that Peter gives, that we are to defend the faith with reverence and respect. And our first task is never to have a pool of arguments that we just throw at the unbeliever. In fact, in the original context of 1 Peter 3:15, he's not even really talking about rational apologetics. He's talking about our suffering for the faith, and that is to be a witness for those who are observing us. Are we suffering for the right reasons? If you're suffering because you refuse to pay your bills or your taxes, or you're a mean boss and you're getting reproach from that, well, you're getting what we call deserved suffering. But if you're suffering for doing what is right, says Peter, then that is something that the Lord will honor and will actually use to draw people to faith.
So Peter talks about being ready to give to every man an answer. I like to say that apologetics is not about victory. It's about truth. It's about communicating the reality and the truth of our faith. What are some of the pitfalls? I mean, I notice at times on social media that the venue itself doesn't always give me the best opportunity to develop ideas. It's kind of a drive-by, kind of hit and respond. Talk to us a little bit about how you navigate that. You're on Facebook.
I'm on Facebook, and there was a time where I commented on YouTube videos and engaged with people, and I discovered that it really isn't a helpful thing to engage in, to get in long-winded YouTube responses with somebody who's making comments on the discussion board. I've even gotten to the point where I don't read comments much when I look at a YouTube video, unless I'm in the video. I might look at what some people are saying about what I've said, but I do that because I don't even know if a single comment that someone gives is going to be very helpful in either dissuading somebody from Christian faith or helping somebody see the light, if you will. Can a drive-by comment on a video do much, or can a post on a Facebook page really do a whole lot to bring people to faith? And so what I usually try to do is I usually invite someone to a dialogue through email, or if we can meet with each other, which I've done before, we'll have dinner or lunch together, and I like to meet them in person because, as you know, and as most teenagers now know with texting, you can get the message, but you might not get the tone. And so many a person is offended at what was said, even if the intent was not to offend, but just to maybe make an observation or something. So I try to avoid social media type encounters as much as I can, in the sense that I don't want to get in a long-winded discussion with anybody on social media.
Because in one sense, there are some challenging elements. Like email, I don't know the tone or the intonation that you may be making.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there are people listening on
Sure.
Facebook, and my pride might get a little affected if I think I'm not doing so well in this tug of war of an argument.
Sure.
So you want to look at opportunities to actually have more interpersonal discussion and a time where you can have, real reflection.
Yeah, this is a fact about myself that a lot of people laugh at, but I went 10 years or so without a cell phone. It wasn't until a year ago that I got my first cell phone in a long time.
You're a dinosaur, huh?
I really am a dinosaur. And I really don't like the medium, because I would much rather have a personal one-on-one conversation with you than to engage in some long-winded texting or even an email with someone. The only reason I would engage in a long-winded email dialogue is if the person that I'm talking to is a long distance away and I simply can't have dinner with them.
And that's a neat feature of Facebook. Inexpensively, you can communicate with people who may be very far away.
Sure. And so if I start up a discussion with someone on Facebook, I would usually just eventually ask, well, can I have your email so that we can engage in something more constructive? And, you can spend as much time as you want making your response. But again, I just want to stress that if I had my own way in all of this, we would all engage in one-on-one interpersonal conversations, because it's only then that you can actually kind of look into a person's eyes and see where they're coming from.
Now, do you think, when we think about persuasion, to be a Christian apologist, you're in the persuasion business. You're trying to maybe take hurdles away from a person believing that Christianity is true, or you're trying to show that, hey, wait a minute, this is a reasonable belief system. Are people persuaded not just by the arguments, but could they be persuaded, at least in part, by the kind of person you are, a loving, caring? Could the ontological or teleological arguments be compared to the way I lovingly, or at least strive to love my wife and be faithful to my kids and my friends? What do you think about that?
I don't think that anyone, this is cliche, I know, but I don't think that anyone is going to care about what you know until they first know that you care. And I don't think that I've ever given an argument for God's existence with someone who was persuaded, who did not first have some kind of relationship with me. I have had students and friends who are atheistic or agnostic in their orientation, and they've read my arguments or listened to me talk, and they've been persuaded that there is a God. So I've seen them move, but it was always in the context of a person who had a relationship with me. I've yet to meet a stranger and off the bat throw an argument at them and persuaded them. It just doesn't work that way.
Now, one thing I notice about you, Travis, is that you have not only non-Christian friends, but you actually have developed friendships with skeptics and atheists. I think the way I came to meet you was talking about a skeptical thinker that you had had some interaction with. He had read a book that I had written. What is that kind of context? What do you relate to the non-Christian differently than you do the Christian, or what is your goal in talking with these skeptics? Do you want to develop a friendship first, or are you trying to get them into the kingdom? What goes on in your mind?
Well, I don't think it's any secret that I'm a Christian, and that because I think that Christianity is true, I want everyone to agree with me insofar as we all believe that God is triune. Christ is the Son of God who rose from the dead on our behalf and died on the cross for our sins. and that we are saved by grace alone. I want everyone to at least embrace what C.S. Lewis calls mere Christianity.
Yeah.
And I want that for everybody because I think it's true. I would like to think that all of my skeptical friends, whether they be atheists or Muslim or Jewish or whatever, feel the same way about me. They want me to convert to their viewpoint because they think it's true. I don't really think that you're an interesting person if you don't have real convictions in these areas. But having said that, I don't have an agenda when I meet anybody. I just want to be their friend. I don't have a time scale where I say, okay, on this date I'm going to give them the gospel, and if they reject the gospel, I'm no longer their friend. I simply don't believe that that's the kind of person that I should be, and I don't think anybody should be that way. We should have friendships and relationships with no agendas other than the relationship itself. That should be the end in and of itself. Again, do I hope that they eventually see me, and more importantly, they hear the message and they agree that it's true? Of course I do. But I'm not going to let the fact that someone just vehemently disagrees with me on something, whether it's politics or religion or anything else in between, I'm not going to let that keep me from being their friend. So am I a different kind of friend to a skeptic than I am a Christian? I hope not. I want to be just as much friends with my non-Christian friends as I am with my Christian friends. Do I have closer relationships with some Christians than other Christians? Of course. And some of my relationships with my non-Christian friends are far more close and intimate than the relationships I have with my Christian friends. And I simply do not want our disagreement in that area to come between us.
You know, both of us believe that salvation is a gift of God. The Greek New Testament word charis, a generous, giving gift that we receive in and through the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I believe that salvation is by grace alone. Nothing is contributed other than God's loving gift that he gives to us in the Son and in the Holy Spirit. However, there are times where people kind of rattle my cage on social media, and unfortunately, I don't always respond as graciously. And I have this cognitive dissonance. One of my deepest values is to be gracious because God has overlooked, forgiven so much in my life, and yet I hold to things.
Jesus gave a parable about that, didn't he? Where he went after those of us who might take advantage of God's grace, but we're not gracious to others.
So we should be troubled by the idea that we say we believe one thing, but the way we live has this conflict. But I'm a sinner. I'm a forgiven sinner. This is something. Does everybody wrestle with this, or is this just Ken Samples?
Well, I wrestle with it. I think that everybody wrestles with this. And I think social media has exacerbated the problem rather than helped it, because there's an anonymity there that allows you to be a little bit mean and feisty, and you can hide behind your anonymity. And I don't think that that's a good or positive thing. I see some of the meanest, cruelest comments coming from non-Christians to Christians when I look at YouTube. And I also see some of the meanest, most non-gracious comments you can come across from Christians against non-Christians on YouTube. And all of it disturbs me. I don't understand why we feel like we have to hate each other just because we disagree. Robert Price is a skeptic that I obviously don't agree with.
Believes Christ is a mythical figure, right?
Yes, he is an atheist, if I understand him correctly. He doesn't think that Jesus even existed.
Once a Christian, or?
Once a Christian. And so it's no secret that I stand against him on so many things. But he wrote a great essay a few years ago where he mentioned how he gets sick and tired of going to atheistic meetings where the atheist at the meeting gives some testimony of how they accomplished this great victory by making sure a manger scene was not displayed in the middle of the town. And he just doesn't, he says, and I think I'm quoting him pretty fairly, he says, "Why should I hate you just because you live in a different universe than I do?"
Interesting.
And I agree with him wholeheartedly. I commented on Facebook how much I liked his essay, and I think that's the attitude we should have. I don't see skeptics as my enemy, unless, of course, they're actually trying to actually do physical harm to me, or they're trying to limit my political rights or something like that. But by and large, the skeptics that I come across, they just want to live out their lives the way I do. And so we should approach these ideas as rational dialogues that we enter into to try to persuade one another as to who's right. But when the discussion's over, we should go see a Marvel movie or have a cup of coffee. Or
let's develop the idea there a bit. Hypocrisy. I like to say that there are two types of hypocrites. Hypocrites with a capital H who live a double life, and then the rest of us who are hypocrites with a lowercase h, which means we struggle to live out this process called sanctification.
Yeah.
And I want to love others. I want to be patient. I want to have the fruit of the Spirit. How concerned should we be with the problem of hypocrisy and those kinds of things? I know we all want to put our best foot forward.
I think we should be very concerned, especially when it comes to our leadership. I think our leadership has a higher standard to follow. And so I'm very disturbed sometimes when I see how Christian leaders behave on the internet especially, but just in general. And there are a lot of double lives that are being led by many of our Christian leaders. And I think that many of them have behaved in such a way that they should never minister again, or at least be disciplined in such a way that they cannot minister for a good long time, a year, 2 years, maybe even more. So I think it's something that the church really needs to step up on and call those who are leading our church to task to live consistently with their profession. We all know, and the skeptics know, that living consistently with your profession does not necessarily mean that you're perfect. And I simply could not take seriously a skeptic or an atheist or any non-Christian who points his finger and says, this pastor made a mistake, or this Christian did something wrong, therefore Christianity is not true, or therefore they should be defrocked, or what have you. But clearly there are guidelines that Paul gives in the New Testament. He says that the minister should be above reproach, because the minister is living as an example for how to live the Christian life for others. And I think, as you said, there's a lower H hypocrisy that we should all strive to get rid of. If you're losing your temper all of the time, and you simply cannot control yourself, if you are an uncontrollable person in general with regard to your passions, that should be something that you should actually have long talks with your pastor or a counselor. You should apologize constantly to people that you lose your temper to or towards on a consistent basis until you've conquered that sin in your life, or else you just really don't have any business witnessing to others about how Christ can change your life when you yourself are doing nothing to strive to change your own life.
Now, for people, I've known people who've had bad experiences with Christian people, maybe at a church,
Sure.
whatever it may be. And they are tempted to think, wow, is this Christianity? Not sure I really want to entertain it. How important do you think, though, it is to communicate that, look, human beings who are Christians are forgiven sinners. They're still battling with their sin nature. They might let you down. Ken Samples might even let you down, but the Lord won't let you down. How would you talk with somebody who feels besmirched or feels like they've been treated rudely by Christian groups?
Well, I would certainly be empathetic, especially depending on the level of abuse they may have experienced. Sometimes people, Jordan Peterson, I think, is right, and Ben Shapiro, I think, is right. They kind of look at our generation as a snowflake generation. A lot of people out there get offended at the drop of a hat, so I would have to listen to the offense. And I think you and I both know that there are a lot of people that are just going to be offended no matter what is said and what is done. But when you look at a genuine case of abuse of a church against an individual Christian, or maybe even spousal abuse within a Christian home, we have to take that very seriously, empathetically, and move in to protect the person who's victimized in that situation. We should always take the side of the true victim and never the person that is abusing the other person. We can't let that person get away with it. And so I think that this is something we should take very seriously, and I think that we're living in a day where I'm not seeing as consistent a witness in those areas as I think we should.
Now, you mentioned before that a lot of people aren't going to be so concerned what you think until they know what you care about, that you have values and you care about them as people. What kind of intellectual virtues do you think are important in communicating? I mean, as Christians, we talk a lot about what I would call moral virtues. Don't steal, be faithful to your spouse, don't lie. Are there intellectual virtues for those of us who are interested in apologetics, in evangelism, who want to communicate our faith? Are there things that you as a scholar attempt to communicate?
Well, I think one of the most important virtues I try to instill in my own work is the courtesy rule. I always try to, and in fact, I'll give you props on this, Ken. I mean, I think a lot of your work manifests the courtesy rule in the sense that you are constantly trying to understand where the person is coming from. I'm far less interested in my own critique of their view than I am their view. I want to understand where they're coming from. And if my critique doesn't work, if my critique of their view is bad, I at least want them to walk away with the knowledge that Travis Campbell did everything he could to try to understand that individual. And the courtesy rule basically says that if you always assume that your opponent in whatever area is consistent and sincere, unless you have very strong evidence to think otherwise.
So you're giving them the benefit of the doubt, trying to understand where they're coming from. I like to call it the golden rule of apologetics. Treat other people's ideas
As
the
you would
way
want
you
yours.
want yours treated. And, that doesn't mean you agree with them. It doesn't mean that you're not critical. But the best apologetic, I think, when I read St. Augustine's City of God or Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, it seems like their arguments are more effective because they actually are very careful in understanding the arguments they're critiquing. Does that strike you as...
Absolutely. And I read a lot of Christian apologetics, and a lot of it is very bad stuff because the scholar did not do the homework necessary to try to understand where this individual is coming from. I'll give you another example of this. Norman Geisler and Abdul Salib did a wonderful job writing a book called Answering Islam.
Yeah, good book.
I'm not going to mention any apologists that fall short of this, but I would like to hold up some apologists that actually exemplify this. And this is a very good book. And what was interesting is when I read the comments on Amazon.com, the reviews of the book, it was interesting that all of the criticisms of the critiques of the book, mainly from the Muslim community, would go on and on about how great the first part of the book was, which means that Geisler and Salib did a wonderful job expounding what Muslims believe. And then they said the second part of the book is extremely bad. Obviously, the person that wrote the second part didn't read the first part, and they would say things like that. And I thought that was funny, but what I liked about the comments and what has allowed me to recommend that book to other people is precisely because a lot of Muslims actually think that the book does a wonderful job expounding upon the beliefs of Muslims. Now you're free to just accept the critique or reject it, come what may, but at least they did that kind of homework. And I think that if we, as Christian apologists, do our best to try to understand where people are coming from and exemplifying that in our exposition of their views, I think we would go a long way to creating more healthy dialogue with those with whom we disagree.
So that's really an intellectual virtue that I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to try to understand what your assumptions are, your presuppositions, the way you reason. And I'm not going to bring the critical hammer down until I've really tried to be fair-minded.
In my own class, I've tried to do that this way. I will spend a full day expounding upon a certain religion. And it's almost like I take on the persona of the proponent. And if I have students walking out of the classroom ready to convert to that religion, I feel like I've done my job.
I teach a world's religions class at Biola University. This is in the apologetics program. And because this is a comparative religion, so we are comparing it with Christianity, I like them to read Houston Smith's book. And I tell them, I want you to read this because when Houston Smith writes about the religions, it's as if he believes every one of them.
Right.
And I think even for persuasion's point of view, the best persuasion comes when you really have engaged the other person at a fair-minded and a careful level. I recently wrote a little article on my Reflections blog about apologetic demeanors. And a World War II fan, I raised the movie Patton.
Very
and
good, yeah.
General Patton with, this audacious, flamboyant,
Right.
The most politically incorrect man maybe in Western civilization.
Right.
But he's contrasted with General Bradley, who's very efficient, deferential. And I raised the question because we like the General Pattons in apologetics. My former boss, Walter Martin, I saw him as the General Patton.
Okay, yeah.
But Hugh Ross, my present boss, is more the Omar Bradley. Very efficient,
Right.
very tough, but with a very different demeanor. Talk a little bit about that. You've been around the apologetics arena, and how does that impact you in terms of the different demeanors that apologists have?
I think our first foot forward should always be a Bradley demeanor.
Okay.
But I do think that there are times where we need to put on our Patton. I mean, our Lord himself.
Got to stand up.
Yeah, our Lord himself, interestingly, was always gentle to the common folk that he ministered to. But he had some pretty harsh words to say to those who were running the religion business of his day, so much so that he even went into the temple and threw tables out of the temple and threw the money changers out of the temple and grabbed people and kicked them out of the temple. So he even got physical on one occasion when it came to obscuring what we would call the gospel and putting money and money lenders and things like that before God's way of salvation. And not only did he hit them physically, but he also gave very harsh words to those who would go out of their way to deceive the people. And I think that we should be prepared to be a Patton sometimes on some occasions. If you come across a skeptic who's lying to the people, if you come across a non-Christian in general, whoever you come across, who is abusing people religiously in the religious realm, I think that we should call them out and we should be very harsh in our criticism of them. But that should be our last move. Our first move should always be to be quite gentle with them and say to them, let's try to understand each other and let's engage in a dialogue.
How important, kind of bringing this to a close, how important is love in the Christian apologetic? I mean, I've heard some people say that love is its own apologetic. Some have suggested it's the ultimate apologetic. How do you tie in your deep commitment to loving God, loving your neighbor? How do you bring that into your intellectual life of being rigorous and arguing for truth?
Well, I don't think that I'm showing love towards unbelievers unless I've gone out of my way to understand them. And I don't think I'm showing love towards them if I'm giving them a half-baked apologetic, in meaning I didn't do my due diligence to try to get at the bottom of whether this argument is a good one. I'm just giving them information to try to get them in the kingdom by hook or by crook, and I'm not really thinking through the arguments. If you encounter a piece of evidence for Christianity and you're not fully convinced of it, you yourself just don't think that it's a very good argument or a piece of evidence, you shouldn't use it in your apologetic encounter. Now, the Christian might say, well, what should I use? You should only use those evidences that you're persuaded of. Well, what evidences are those? Well, in a lot of ways, these things are person relative. I'm strange in one sense because I find a whole host of evidences very persuasive that convince me that God exists and that Christ is the unique Son of God because he rose from the dead. But some Christians are going to gravitate towards a kind of Anselmian approach where it's more rational, heady, abstract. And so you might have an ontological argument that we just discussed, or some people are going to be more empirical in their approach, and so they're going to prefer Thomas Aquinas, or in the modern era, a Hugh Ross. Some people like science apologetics, so they'll follow Ross or the Discovery Institute or someone like that. Some people like philosophical apologetics, so they'll like Alvin Plantinga or William Lane Craig or someone like that. And Craig, of course, is a really good mix of both, right? He has a very strong philosophical approach, but he also engages in the scientific literature. So I think that every Christian who wants to be an evangelist and a defender of the faith should master at least one or two arguments for God's existence, and then one or two or three reasons why they think the Bible is inspired by God, and or why they think Jesus is the Son of God. And that should be part of your apologetic arsenal that you take around with you. The most important thing, though, of course, is how are you treating those people? Do you love them? Are you spending your nights on YouTube giving harsh comments, trolling YouTube channels and giving harsh comments to non-Christians and treating them horribly, and then getting up and going to work and just going about your day? That's the kind of double life that I don't think that the Lord would honor. So what kind of life are you living when no one's watching? Are you comfortable in your anonymity? All those questions should be challenging to you, and you should think through them before you would dare commend the gospel to an unbeliever.
So in talking with people who don't share your worldview, you want to get to know them, you care about them, you may discover that they have leanings in particular areas. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're more inclined to want to talk about mathematics and science, mm-hmm. or maybe they're more artistic and they want to reflect on the challenge of beauty, but there's no way of knowing where they want to go or what they're interested in unless you listen. I often think to myself that I try to understand somebody's point of view, not so I can refute it, but so that I can actually understand it. But to do that, I have to listen. I have to find out who they are, where they're coming from.
And I just would add to that when I meet anyone, as I said before, I don't have an agenda. So you're not going to find me out there talking to people trying to set up a platform so I can present an argument for God's existence. I just don't do that. I simply talk with people about whatever it is they want to talk about. I want to be their friend, and again, that is an end game for me. But when the opportunity arises, I'm ready to offer them my reasons for the hope that is in me. Sometimes they're very, what I might call mundane or emotional reasons. I don't want to live in a world in which God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I think life is meaningless without God. And some people might say, well, that's an emotional reason to believe in God. Sure. But then again, we're emotional beings. Yeah. And one of the things that I like about the Christian worldview is it appeals to the whole person. Reason, emotions, our will. It imposes a certain discipline upon us, and yet at the same time, it says that we're saved all of grace. And so I think that you get the whole enchilada in the Christian worldview in a way that you don't get in others.
Travis, you wrote an article for me that we have up on the Reflections blog, 10 Commandments of Christian Scholarship. I want to commend that to our listeners. I thought your presentation, it reflects, again, what I would call the golden rule of apologetics. And having you here as a visiting scholar is a lot of fun because we get to go in my office and talk about ideas and
I get to make fun of you for all your copies of Augustine's Confessions.
That's right. I told you, you asked me, why do you have so many copies of the same book? And I said, well...
Of the same edition.
The same edition.
Of the same book.
and I said, I have more than I need, but not as many as I want.
That's right. That's right.
Good being with you and talking with you.
Well, thank you.